Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Family Facade. David Finley stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown law office, surveying the city skyline with the calculating gaze of a man who had built his reputation on never losing a case. At 38, he was one of the most feared criminal defense attorneys in the state, known for his ruthless tactics and unwavering dedication to protecting his clients, no matter how guilty they might be. David had grown up in a working-class family where his father, a police detective, had taught him that the world was divided into predators and prey. "Never let anyone see weakness, son," his father had always said. "The moment you show mercy is the moment they destroy you." Those lessons had served David well in his legal career, where he'd learned to exploit every loophole, manipulate every witness, and crush every opponent who stood between him and victory. His marriage to Christine Walls had seemed like the perfect complement to his success. Christine was beautiful, sophisticated, and came from a wealthy family that had provided valuable connections for David's practice. They'd met at a charity gala where Christine had been working as an event coordinator, her charm and social skills making her the ideal wife for an ambitious attorney. Their daughter Emma had been the final piece of their seemingly perfect life. At 6 years old, she was bright, curious, and completely devoted to her father. David's relationship with Emma was one of the few aspects of his life where his guard came down completely. He adored her unconditionally, and she represented everything pure and good in his otherwise cynical world. But David's keen instincts, honed by years of reading people in courtrooms, had begun to detect subtle changes in his family dynamic. Christine had grown distant over the past few months, making excuses to avoid family activities and spending increasing amounts of time working late on events that didn't seem to require her extended presence. More troubling was the behavior of Christine's mother, Diane Mann, a controlling woman in her 60s who had never approved of David's middle-class background. Diane had been making unusual comments about Emma's upbringing, suggesting that the child needed proper discipline and that David was too permissive as a father. "That girl is becoming spoiled," Diane had said during their last family dinner. "She needs to learn respect for authority before it's too late. In my day, children who misbehaved faced real consequences." David had dismissed these comments as typical grandmother complaints, but something in Diane's tone had set off alarm bells. His years of cross-examining hostile witnesses had taught him to recognize when someone was concealing their true motivations. The first concrete evidence of trouble came when David discovered that Christine had been making unexplained withdrawals from their joint savings account. When he confronted her about it, she claimed the money was for surprise anniversary gifts and charity donations, but her explanations were vague and inconsistent. David's investigative instincts kicked in, and he hired a private investigator, Eric Booth, a former police detective who specialized in domestic surveillance. Eric's initial report confirmed David's suspicions. Christine was having an affair with Clayton Lindsay, a real estate developer who was known for his predatory business practices and expensive lifestyle. Clayton Lindsay was everything David despised, a trust fund baby who had inherited his father's real estate empire and used his wealth to manipulate and corrupt everyone around him. He was married to a socialite named Bethany Skinner, but his reputation for infidelity was well known in their social circles. The affair had been going on for 6 months, with Christine and Clayton meeting at expensive hotels and private properties under the pretense of planning charity events. But what disturbed David most was the discovery that Diane Mann was not only aware of the affair, but actively facilitating it. Eric's surveillance revealed that Diane had been providing alibis for Christine, babysitting Emma during the affair meetings, and even helping to launder money from the joint account to fund Christine's expenses with Clayton. The three of them were working together in a conspiracy that went far beyond simple adultery. David's legal mind began analyzing the situation like a complex case. Christine's affair was just the surface level. There had to be a deeper motivation for Diane's involvement and the coordinated nature of their deception. In his experience, when multiple parties conspired in domestic betrayal, There was usually a financial motive hidden beneath the emotional drama. A breakthrough came when Eric discovered that Clayton Lindsay had been in financial trouble for the past year. His real estate empire was built on leveraged investments that had soured when interest rates rose, and he was facing potential bankruptcy unless he could secure significant capital quickly. David realized that Christine and her mother weren't just betraying his marriage. They were positioning themselves to steal his assets and destroy his family for Clayton's financial benefit. The affair was a means to an end, designed to create grounds for a divorce that would give Christine half of everything David had worked to build. But David Finley had spent his career destroying people who tried to manipulate the legal system for their own gain. He wasn't about to let his own family become victims of such a scheme, especially when it threatened his beloved daughter Emma. As David sat in his office that evening, reviewing Eric's surveillance reports and planning his response, he felt the cold fury that had made him legendary in courtrooms across the state. Christine, Clayton, and Diane had made the fatal mistake of underestimating him, assuming that his love for his family would make him vulnerable to their manipulation. They were about to learn that David Finley's protective instincts were far more dangerous than his professional reputation had ever suggested. The game was beginning, and David intended to win completely. Chapter 2. The Web of Deception. David spent the following weeks carefully documenting every aspect of Christine's betrayal while maintaining the facade of an unsuspecting husband. His legal training had taught him that the best cases were won through meticulous preparation and overwhelming evidence, and he applied those same principles to planning his response to his family's conspiracy. Eric Booth's investigation revealed the full scope of the plot against David's family. Christine had been systematically transferring money from their joint account to a private account that she shared with Diane Mann. The funds were being used not just to finance her affair with Clayton Lindsay, but to pay for legal consultations with divorce attorneys who specialized in asset seizure. The most damning discovery came when Eric obtained recordings of conversations between Christine and Diane, revealing their true motivations. They weren't just planning to divorce David and take half his assets. They were plotting to gain full custody of Emma and use her as leverage to extract even more money from David's successful law practice. David's too attached to that girl, Christine had said in one recorded conversation. He'll pay anything to keep seeing her. We can bleed him dry for years if we play this right. Diane's response had been even more calculating. The key is making him look like an unfit father. We need to document incidents that show he's unstable, violent, or neglectful. Then we can use Emma's well-being as justification for whatever we want. David listened to these recordings in his office late one night, his hands clenched into fists as he heard his wife and mother-in-law discussing his daughter like she was a commodity to be exploited. Emma was an innocent child who adored both her parents, and the idea of using her emotional well-being as a weapon in their scheme filled David with a rage he'd never experienced. But the recordings also revealed something else that concerned David deeply. Diane Mann's disturbing comments about disciplining Emma if she became a problem for their plans. Diane had a history of being controlling and manipulative, but her recent statements suggested she might be willing to harm Emma physically if the child interfered with their conspiracy. If that little brat starts asking too many questions or getting in the way, I'll handle her, Diane had said in one conversation. Children need to learn their place, and sometimes that requires harsh lessons. David's protective instincts went into overdrive. He'd always been suspicious of Diane's old-fashioned views on child discipline, but now he realized that his daughter might be in actual danger from her own grandmother. David began implementing a multi-layered strategy to protect Emma while gathering evidence against his conspirators. He installed hidden security cameras throughout their home, obtained court orders to monitor the financial accounts Christine thought were secret, and arranged for discreet surveillance of Diane's house, where Emma often stayed overnight. The security measures proved prescient when David discovered that Diane had been giving Emma inappropriate medications to make her more compliant during visits. The hidden cameras captured Diane forcing Emma to take pills that weren't prescribed by any doctor, then threatening the child with punishment if she told her parents about the special vitamins. David immediately took Emma to a pediatrician who confirmed that she had been given adult sleep medication and anxiety drugs that could have caused serious harm to a child her age. The doctor was required to report the suspected abuse to Child Protective Services, but David used his legal connections to ensure the investigation was handled discreetly while he gathered additional evidence. Meanwhile, David's investigation into Clayton Lindsay revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Clayton's real estate empire was indeed on the verge of collapse, but he'd been hiding his financial problems from investors and creditors through fraudulent accounting practices. More importantly, Clayton had a history of violent behavior toward women that had been covered up by expensive lawyers and strategic settlements. David obtained police reports from 3 different incidents where Clayton had been arrested for domestic violence, only to have the charges dropped when his victims were pressured or paid to recant their statements. One of the victims, a former girlfriend named Amanda Ingram, had been hospitalized with severe injuries but had later claimed she'd fallen downstairs. David arranged a private meeting with Amanda Ingram, using his reputation as a skilled attorney to convince her to tell the truth about Clayton's violence. Amanda was initially reluctant, but David's promise of legal protection and his evidence of Clayton's ongoing financial crimes eventually persuaded her to cooperate. "Clayton is a monster," Amanda told David during their meeting. "He gets off on hurting women who can't fight back. When he gets angry, he becomes someone else entirely, someone who enjoys causing pain." Amanda's testimony provided David with crucial ammunition, but it also raised terrifying questions about Christine's safety and judgment. If Christine was involved with a man who had a history of violence against women, what did that mean for Emma's well-being when she was in their care? David's worst fears were realized when Eric's surveillance captured a disturbing incident at Diane's house. Emma had been staying overnight while Christine claimed to be at a charity event, but the hidden cameras David had placed revealed that Christine had actually been at Clayton's apartment. During the overnight stay, Diane had become increasingly agitated with Emma's questions about her mother's whereabouts. When Emma began crying and asking to call her father, Diane had grabbed the child roughly and forced her into a basement room, threatening to leave her there all night if she didn't stop crying. The footage was heartbreaking and infuriating. David watched his 6-year-old daughter being terrorized by her own grandmother, while Christine was betraying their family with a violent criminal. The basement room where Diane had confined Emma was dark, cold, and completely inappropriate for a child. David realized that his family's conspiracy had crossed the line for financial betrayal and child abuse. Emma was being used as a pawn in their scheme, and her physical and emotional safety was being sacrificed for their greed and selfishness. But David also recognized an opportunity. Diane's abusive behavior and Christine's neglect provided him with powerful evidence that could destroy their custody plans and expose their true motivations. If he played his cards correctly, he could not only protect Emma, but ensure that her abusers faced severe consequences for their actions. David began planning the final phase of his strategy, knowing that he would need to be patient and calculating to achieve the complete destruction of everyone who had threatened his daughter. Christine, Clayton, and Diane had made the mistake of targeting the one person in the world that David would kill to protect. They were about to learn that some fathers were far more dangerous than they appeared. Chapter 3. The Trap is Set. David's strategy entered its most critical phase as he prepared to expose his family's conspiracy while ensuring Emma's safety. He knew that confronting Christine and Diane directly would only drive them underground and potentially put Emma in greater danger. Instead, he decided to create a scenario that would force them to reveal their true nature while providing him with undeniable evidence of their crimes. The opportunity came when Christine suggested that she and David take a long-overdue vacation to repair their marriage. David recognized this as part of her plan to create an alibi for the next phase of their scheme, but he also saw it as the perfect trap. "We could go to that resort in the mountains you've always wanted to visit," Christine suggested one evening, her voice carrying the false sweetness David had learned to recognize. "Just the 2 of us for a week. My mother could watch Emma. She's always saying she doesn't get enough time with her granddaughter." David pretended to consider the suggestion, while internally calculating how to turn Christine's plan against her. "That sounds wonderful," he replied. "But are you sure your mother can handle Emma for a whole week? She's been complaining about her energy level lately." "Mother insists she can manage," Christine assured him. "She says Emma needs to learn more discipline anyway, and a week with her grandmother would be good for her character development." The phrase character development sent chills down David's spine, given what he'd observed about Diane's methods of discipline. But it also provided him with the opening he needed to implement his plan. David agreed to the vacation, but secretly arranged for enhanced surveillance of Diane's house and established emergency protocols with Eric Booth. He also prepared legal documents that would give him immediate custody of Emma if evidence of abuse was discovered, and he briefed his most trusted associates about the situation. Most importantly, David gave Emma a special phone, disguised as a toy, that would allow her to contact him directly if she felt unsafe. He taught her how to use it during a private father-daughter outing, explaining it as a secret game they could play while he was away. "If Grandma Diane makes you scared or uncomfortable, you can call Daddy with this special phone," David explained gently. "No matter what anyone tells you, Daddy will always come if you need help." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding that this was something important even if she didn't grasp the full implications. David's heart ached as he looked at his innocent daughter, knowing that he was deliberately placing her in a dangerous situation to expose the conspiracy against their family. The vacation began exactly as David had predicted. Christine was overly affectionate and attentive during their first 2 days at the resort, playing the role of the loving wife trying to save her marriage. But David noticed her checking her phone constantly and making excuses to take private calls from work. Eric's surveillance confirmed that Christine was coordinating with Clayton Lindsay, who had arrived in the same mountain town and was staying at a different hotel. They were planning to meet once Christine established her alibi of working on their marriage with David. Meanwhile, the cameras at Diane's house revealed increasingly disturbing behavior toward Emma. Diane had immediately begun implementing harsh discipline routines, forcing Emma to sit in uncomfortable positions for hours and threatening severe punishment for minor infractions. On the second night of the vacation, Diane's abuse escalated significantly. Emma had asked to call her parents, and Diane had responded by forcing the child into the basement and locking the door. The surveillance footage showed Emma crying and pleading to be let out, while Diane ignored her distress. David watched the live feed from his hotel room, his hands shaking with rage as he saw his daughter's terror. But he forced himself to wait, knowing that he needed more evidence to ensure Diane's complete destruction and to prove that Christine was complicit in the abuse. The breaking point came on the third day when Diane's behavior became genuinely dangerous. Emma had apparently tried to use the regular house phone to call her parents, and Diane had flown into a rage that was captured on multiple cameras. David watched in horror as Diane grabbed Emma roughly, dragging her to the basement and securing her wrists with zip ties to prevent her from escaping. The elderly woman then turned off the basement lights, leaving Emma alone in the dark while she returned upstairs to continue her daily routine. This wasn't discipline, it was torture. A 6-year-old child was being terrorized and physically restrained by her own grandmother, while her mother was betraying her family with a violent criminal. David's legal mind recognized that Diane's actions constituted multiple felonies, including child abuse, false imprisonment, and reckless endangerment. But what pushed David over the edge was Emma's desperate attempt to reach him using the special phone he'd given her. The child had managed to access the device despite her restraints, and David's phone buzzed with an incoming video call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Emma's tear-streaked face appeared on his screen, her small voice breaking as she spoke the words that would trigger David's complete transformation from protective father to avenging angel. "Daddy, help me please," Emma cried, the camera showing the zip ties around her wrists and the dark basement where she was imprisoned. "Grandma Diane hurt me and won't let me go. I'm scared, Daddy. Please come home." David saw the bruises on his daughter's arms where Diane had grabbed her and the terror in Emma's eyes as she begged for rescue. In that moment, every civilized instinct David possessed was replaced by primal fury that demanded immediate and brutal justice. "I'm coming, sweetheart," David said, his voice calm despite the rage burning inside him. "Daddy's coming right now." and I'm going to make sure you're safe. Just hold on for me." David hung up and immediately called Eric Booth, his voice deadly cold as he issued instructions. "Get to Diane's house now. Emma is in immediate danger. Document everything, call the police, but don't intervene until I arrive. I want to handle this personally." David then turned to Christine, who was lounging by the pool completely unaware that her conspiracy was about to destroy her life. His expression must have been terrifying because her face went pale when she saw him approaching. "We're leaving," David announced. "Right now." "What's wrong?" Christine asked, her voice carrying a note of panic. "Did something happen?" David smiled, and it was the cold smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Yes, Christine, something happened. Your mother just made the biggest mistake of her life, and you're about to pay for it alongside her." As they rushed back toward the city, David's mind was already calculating the complete destruction of everyone who had threatened his daughter. Diane Mann would face criminal charges that would put her in prison for the rest of her life. Christine would lose everything in a divorce that would leave her destitute and publicly humiliated. Clayton Lindsay would discover that his violent past had finally caught up with him in ways he never imagined. But first, David had a basement door to open and a daughter to rescue. And when he found what waited for him there, the evidence would be so overwhelming that even the most corrupt judge would have no choice but to deliver justice. The drive home was the longest 2 hours of David's life, but it was also the time when he transformed from a man seeking justice into something far more dangerous. By the time he reached Diane's house, David Finley, the protective father, had become David Finley, the destroyer of lives. Chapter 4. The Moment of Truth. David's car screeched to a halt outside Diane Mann's house at 3 in the morning, his hands still trembling from the image of his daughter's terrified face on the video call. Eric Booth was waiting in the shadows, his expression grim as he briefed David on what the surveillance had captured during the drive home. "It's worse than we thought," Eric reported quietly. "Diane has Emma restrained in the basement, and she's been down there for over 6 hours. The child is clearly in distress, and Diane has shown no intention of checking on her welfare." David's jaw clenched as he absorbed this information. 6 hours of terror for a 6-year-old child, while her grandmother continued her normal evening routine upstairs as if nothing was happening. The calculated cruelty of it was beyond comprehension. "Where's Christine?" David asked, his voice deadly calm. "Still on her way back. She's been calling and texting frantically since you left the resort, but Diane isn't answering. She knows something's wrong." David nodded grimly. Christine's panic was confirmation that she knew about her mother's abuse and had been counting on the vacation to provide her with plausible deniability. But her frantic attempts to contact Diane proved that she was complicit in the conspiracy to harm Emma. "Have you called the police?" David asked. "They're en route, but I wanted you here first. You need to see this with your own eyes, and we need to document your initial reaction for the custody case." David understood. His response to discovering Emma's abuse would be crucial evidence in the legal battles that would follow. But more importantly, he needed to rescue his daughter immediately and ensure that the evidence against Diane was absolutely overwhelming. David approached the front door of Diane's house, noting that all the lights were off except for a single lamp in the living room. The house appeared normal from the outside, but David knew that his daughter was suffering in the basement below. Using the key Diane had given him years ago for emergencies, David entered the house quietly. The living room showed signs of Diane's normal evening routine. A cup of tea on the coffee table, the television still playing a late-night talk show, and a book open beside her reading chair. The normalcy of the scene made David's rage burn even hotter. Diane had tortured his daughter for hours, then settled down for a peaceful evening of television and reading as if nothing had happened. The woman was either completely psychotic or so consumed with spite that she no longer recognized Emma as a human being worthy of basic compassion. David made his way toward the basement door, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floors. Behind him, he could hear Eric documenting everything with a camera, ensuring that every moment of the rescue would be preserved for the criminal prosecution that would follow. The basement door was locked, and David could hear faint sounds from below, his daughter's quiet sobs and occasional calls for help that grew weaker as her voice gave out from hours of crying. The sound of Emma's distress triggered something primal in David's chest, a fury so complete that his vision actually narrowed as adrenaline flooded his system. David forced the basement door open, the lock splintering under the pressure of his rage-fueled strength. As he descended the stairs, the full scope of Diane's cruelty became visible, and what he found there made him call the police with trembling hands, not from fear, but from barely controlled homicidal rage. Emma was chained to a metal post in the center of the basement, her small wrists secured with zip ties that had cut into her skin from her struggles to escape. She was sitting on the cold concrete floor in her pajamas, shivering from the basement's temperature and trauma from hours of abandonment. But the physical restraints weren't the worst of it. Diane had deliberately placed Emma in a position where she could see a collection of disturbing items arranged on a nearby table. Restraints, disciplinary tools, and photographs of other children who appeared to have been subjected to similar treatment. David realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't Diane's first time abusing a child. The basement had been prepared specifically for this purpose, with hooks in the ceiling, restraint points along the walls, and a collection of implements designed to terrorize and control children. Emma looked up when she heard David's footsteps, her face lighting up with desperate relief, even as tears continued streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "You came. Grandma Diane said you wouldn't come, that nobody would believe me if I told." David knelt beside his daughter, his hands shaking as he carefully cut the zip ties that had bound her wrists. The marks on her skin would serve as evidence, but more importantly, Emma was alive and would recover from this trauma with proper care and support. "I'm here, sweetheart," David said gently, lifting Emma into his arms and carrying her away from the horrific scene. "Daddy's here, and you're safe now. Grandma Diane will never hurt you again." As David carried Emma upstairs, Eric continued documenting the basement chamber and its contents. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a case of discipline gone too far, but a deliberate torture chamber designed specifically for child abuse. David called 911 from the living room, his voice steady despite the fury burning in his chest. "This is David Finley. I need police and emergency medical services at 247 Maple Street immediately. I've just discovered that my 6-year-old daughter has been physically abused and falsely imprisoned by my mother-in-law. The child needs medical attention, and the perpetrator needs to be arrested." The dispatcher's questions were routine, but David's answers painted a picture of systematic child abuse that would trigger a major investigation. Emma was taken to the hospital for evaluation and treatment, while police secured the scene and began collecting evidence. Diane Mann was arrested at her Bridge club 2 hours later, her shocked protests that she'd done nothing wrong falling on deaf ears, as the evidence of her crimes was already documented and photographed. The woman who had tortured David's daughter spent her first night in jail, and it would be far from her last. But David's fury wasn't satisfied by Diane's arrest. Christine had been complicit in placing Emma in danger, and Clayton Lindsay had been the financial motivation behind the entire conspiracy. Both of them would face consequences that would destroy their lives as completely as they had tried to destroy David's family. The police investigation revealed that Diane's basement chamber had been used multiple times over the years, with evidence suggesting that she had abused other children in her care. Her arrest triggered a broader investigation that would eventually expose a network of child abuse that had been covered up by wealthy families who valued their reputations more than children's safety. As David sat beside Emma's hospital bed, watching his daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in days, he made a silent vow that would guide his actions for the rest of his life. Everyone who had participated in harming his daughter would face justice, and that justice would be swift, complete, and utterly merciless. Diane Mann, Christine Walls, and Clayton Lindsay had made the fatal mistake of targeting the one person in the world that David would kill to protect. Now, they would learn that some fathers were far more dangerous than they appeared, and some betrayals carried consequences that lasted forever. Chapter 5: The Unraveling. The hospital room where Emma recovered became David's war room as he coordinated the systematic destruction of everyone who had conspired against his family. While his daughter slept under medical supervision, David worked with a team of investigators, prosecutors, and legal experts to ensure that justice would be swift and absolute. Emma's medical examination had revealed the full extent of Diane's abuse. Beyond the physical injuries from the restraints, Emma showed signs of psychological trauma consistent with prolonged emotional abuse. The pediatric psychologist who evaluated her reported that Emma had been systematically terrorized and threatened with escalating violence if she revealed what had happened to her. "Your daughter is remarkably resilient," Dr. and Rutherford told David during a private consultation. "But the abuse she suffered was calculated and deliberate. This wasn't a case of discipline gone too far. It was systematic torture designed to break a child's spirit and establish complete control over her." David absorbed this information with cold fury, knowing that every detail would be crucial for the criminal prosecution that would follow. But he also recognized that the legal system, despite its eventual justice, would be too slow and too limited to provide the complete accountability he demanded. Christine arrived at the hospital 6 hours after David's discovery, her face a mask of false concern and barely concealed panic. She'd driven straight from the mountains, but David's private investigators had tracked her movements and confirmed that she'd made multiple stops to meet with lawyers and contact Clayton Lindsay. "Oh my God, David," Christine said as she entered Emma's room. "What happened? Is she okay? I came as soon as I got your message." David studied his wife's performance, noting the calculated nature of her concern and the way her eyes avoided meeting his directly. "Diane abused her, Christine. She chained our daughter in her basement and tortured her for hours while we were away." Christine's reaction was telling. Instead of shock or outrage, her first response was to minimize the situation and deflect blame. "That can't be right," Christine protested. "Mother would never hurt Emma. There must be some misunderstanding. Maybe Emma got confused, or maybe she's exaggerating because she missed us." David's jaw clenched as he heard his wife suggest that their traumatized daughter was lying about being abused. "The police have photographs, Christine. There's video evidence." Diane restrained Emma with zip ties and left her chained in a basement for 6 hours. Christine's face went pale as she realized the implications. If there was video evidence, then the abuse was undeniable, and her own complicity in placing Emma in danger would be exposed. "I had no idea," Christine said quickly. "If I'd known Mother was capable of something like this, I never would have left Emma with her. This is as much a shock to me as it is to you." David smiled coldly. "Is it, Christine? Because I have recordings of you and your mother discussing Emma's discipline and how she needed to learn her place. I also have evidence of your affair with Clayton Lindsay and your plan to use Emma as leverage in a custody battle." The color drained from Christine's face completely as she realized that David knew about the conspiracy. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been protecting my family," David corrected. "And it's a good thing I was, because your mother nearly killed our daughter while you were planning to betray our marriage." Christine's mask of concern finally slipped, revealing the calculating manipulator underneath. "You can't prove I knew what Mother was planning. Even if I was having an affair, that doesn't make me responsible for her actions." "Actually, it does," David replied. "Because you knew about Diane's history of abusive behavior, and you deliberately placed Emma in her care so you could establish an alibi for your infidelity. That makes you legally responsible for child endangerment and conspiracy to commit abuse." Christine's panic was now visible as she realized the full scope of her legal jeopardy. "David, please. We can work this out. I made mistakes, but I never wanted Emma to get hurt. If you'll forgive me, we can rebuild our marriage and put this behind us." David's laugh was devoid of warmth. "Forgive you? Christine, you conspired with your mother to abuse our daughter and with your lover to steal our assets. Some things are unforgivable, and this is one of them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Willard McCall, the lead investigator on Diane's case. Detective McCall was a veteran officer who specialized in child abuse cases, and his expression was grim as he briefed David on the investigation's progress. We've executed search warrants on Diane Mann's property and found extensive evidence of systematic child abuse, Detective McCall reported. The basement chamber was equipped for restraining and terrorizing children, and we've found photographs and videos that suggest multiple victims over several years. David's fury intensified as he learned that Emma wasn't Diane's first victim. How many children? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests at least 6 children over the past decade, all from wealthy families, all abused under the guise of discipline or character building. Christine gasped audibly, either from genuine shock or from realization that her mother's crimes were far worse than she'd imagined. I had no idea Mother was doing anything like this to other children. Detective McCall studied Christine carefully. Mrs. Finley, we need to ask you some questions about your knowledge of your mother's activities. We found evidence that suggests family members were aware of the abuse and may have been complicit in covering it up. Christine's panic escalated as she realized that she was now a target of the criminal investigation. I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything else without legal representation. David watched with satisfaction as his wife demanded legal protection, knowing that her guilty conscience was already revealing her complicity. An innocent person would have cooperated fully with the investigation to help protect other children, but Christine's first instinct was to protect herself. As Christine was escorted from the hospital by police for formal questioning, David turned his attention to the next phase of his plan. Diane's arrest and Christine's complicity were just the beginning. Clayton Lindsay still needed to face consequences for his role in the conspiracy that had endangered Emma's life. David's investigation into Clayton's affairs had revealed that the man's financial desperation was even worse than initially suspected. Clayton had been using fraudulent investment schemes to steal money from his clients, including several elderly victims who had lost their life savings to his manipulations. But more importantly for David's purposes, Clayton's history of violence against women provided opportunities for creative justice that the legal system might not deliver. Amanda Ingram's testimony about Clayton's abusive behavior was just one piece of a larger pattern that David intended to expose in the most public and humiliating way possible. David made a series of phone calls from Emma's hospital room, coordinating with prosecutors, private investigators, and media contacts to ensure that Clayton Lindsay's destruction would be complete and permanent. The man who had conspired to steal David's assets and endangered his daughter's life was about to discover that some enemies were too dangerous to make. As Emma began to wake up from her peaceful sleep, David sat beside her bed and took her small hand in his. His daughter would recover from this trauma, but the people who had caused it would never recover from what David was about to do to them. The game was entering its final phase, and David intended to win completely. Chapter 6: The Network of Corruption. As Emma's condition stabilized and she began the long process of psychological recovery, David's investigation into the conspiracy against his family revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond his personal betrayal. The basement chamber in Diane's house was just one piece of a larger network of wealthy families who had been covering up child abuse for years. Detective McCall's investigation had uncovered evidence that Diane Mann was part of an informal network of wealthy grandparents and caregivers who used systematic abuse to discipline children from prominent families. The abuse was always framed as character building or traditional values, but the reality was calculated torture designed to create compliant, traumatized children who wouldn't question adult authority. We've identified at least 12 families that were connected to this network, Detective McCall informed David during a private briefing. The children were abused by various caregivers, but the families covered it up to protect their social reputations. Your mother-in-law was one of the worst offenders, but she wasn't acting alone. David absorbed this information with growing fury. Emma's abuse wasn't an isolated incident of a grandmother's excessive discipline. It was part of a systematic network of child torture that had been protected by wealthy families who valued their social standing more than children's welfare. What's being done about the other families? David asked. That's where it gets complicated, Detective McCall admitted. Most of the children are now adults, and many of them have been too traumatized or intimidated to come forward. The families involved have significant political and financial influence, so the investigation has to be handled carefully. David's legal mind immediately recognized the challenge. Prosecuting wealthy, influential families for decades-old child abuse would require overwhelming evidence and ironclad cases that couldn't be dismissed or covered up through political pressure. "I want to help," David said firmly. "Whatever resources you need, whatever legal support is required, I'll provide it." These people destroyed children's lives to protect their reputations, and they need to face consequences. Detective McCall nodded gratefully. "We were hoping you'd say that. Your legal expertise and your personal motivation could be crucial for building cases that will actually result in convictions." David's decision to support the broader investigation wasn't just about justice for other victims. It was also strategic. By positioning himself as a crusader against child abuse, he would gain public sympathy and moral authority that would be crucial for destroying Christine and Clayton's reputations. Meanwhile, David's private investigation into Clayton Lindsay had revealed connections to the child abuse network that went beyond his relationship with Christine. Clayton's real estate empire had been used to facilitate the abuse network by providing private properties where children could be taken for discipline away from their family homes. Eric Booth's investigation discovered that Clayton owned several remote properties that had been equipped specifically for restraining and terrorizing children. The properties were marketed as therapeutic retreat centers for troubled youth, but the reality was far more sinister. Clayton's been renting these properties to wealthy families who wanted to have their children corrected without leaving evidence in their own homes, Eric reported. "We've found restraint equipment, surveillance cameras, and documentation of at least 20 children who were taken to these facilities over the past 5 years." David's fury reached new heights as he realized that Clayton Lindsay wasn't just a financial manipulator and domestic abuser. He was a facilitator of systematic child torture who had profited from the suffering of dozens of children. "We need to coordinate with Detective McCall immediately," David instructed. "This evidence could be crucial for the broader investigation, and I want Clayton's role in the network fully exposed." The coordination between David's private investigation and the police investigation created a powerful alliance that the child abuse network couldn't withstand. David's legal expertise helped prosecutors build stronger cases, while his financial resources allowed for investigations that might otherwise have been limited by budget constraints. But David's most effective weapon was his growing media campaign to expose the network of corruption. Using his connections in the legal community and his reputation as a successful attorney, David began granting interviews and providing information to journalists who specialized in investigative reporting. The story that emerged was shocking even by the standards of wealthy family scandals. A network of prominent families had been systematically abusing their children and grandchildren for decades, using private facilities and complicit caregivers to torture children into complete submission. The media coverage created a public outcry that made it impossible for the wealthy families to cover up their crimes through political influence. Parents of the abused children began coming forward, and survivors found the courage to testify about their experiences. Christine's role in the conspiracy became a focal point of the media coverage, partly because of David's strategic leaks, but also because her case was the most recent and well-documented. The woman who had betrayed her husband and endangered her daughter became the public face of parental complicity in child abuse. Christine Finley knew her mother had a history of abusive behavior toward children, David told a television reporter during a carefully staged interview. "She deliberately placed our 6-year-old daughter in her mother's care so she could establish an alibi for her affair with a man who facilitated child abuse through his real estate properties. That's not just marital betrayal. That's criminal conspiracy to endanger a child." The interview was broadcast during prime time, and Christine's reputation was destroyed overnight. Her social circle abandoned her. Her professional contacts refused to work with her, and her own family began to distance themselves from the scandal. Clayton Lindsay's destruction was even more complete. The revelation that his real estate empire had been used to facilitate child abuse triggered a federal investigation that uncovered massive financial fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering charges. His marriage to Bethany Skinner ended in a divorce that left him financially ruined, and his business empire collapsed under the weight of criminal investigations and civil lawsuits. But David's most satisfying victory came when Clayton attempted to flee the country to avoid prosecution. David had anticipated this move and had been working with federal authorities to monitor Clayton's activities. When Clayton tried to board a private jet to a non-extradition country, he was arrested at the airport on federal charges that would put him in prison for the rest of his life. As David watched the news coverage of Clayton's arrest, he felt a grim satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The man who had conspired to steal his assets and facilitated the abuse of his daughter was now facing a life sentence in federal prison, where his history of violence against women and children would make him a target for other inmates. But David's revenge wasn't complete yet. Christine still needed to face the full consequences of her betrayal, and David intended to ensure that her punishment was as complete and permanent as possible. The final phase of David's plan was about to begin. It would demonstrate that some fathers were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Chapter 7. The Courtroom Crucifixion. 6 months after Emma's rescue from Diane's basement, David stood in the courthouse where he had won countless cases for other clients. But this time he was fighting for his daughter's future and his family's justice. The criminal trial of Diane Mann had become a media sensation, with David serving as both a victim's advocate and a star witness in the prosecution's case. Emma had made remarkable progress in her recovery, thanks to intensive therapy and David's unwavering support. Dr. and Rutherford reported that while Emma would need ongoing psychological care, she was demonstrating the resilience of a child who knew she was protected and loved by her father. Emma understands that what happened to her was wrong, and she knows that her father will never let anyone hurt her again, Dr. Rutherford told the court during her testimony. That sense of security is crucial for her continued healing. David had insisted on testifying personally about discovering Emma in Diane's basement, despite his lawyer's concerns that his emotional testimony might be too intense for the jury. But David's rage had been channeled into a cold, prosecutorial presentation that was far more effective than any emotional outburst. When I opened that basement door and saw my 6-year-old daughter chained to a metal post, with marks on her wrist from struggling to escape, I realized that Diane Mann wasn't just an abusive grandmother, David testified. She was a predator who had systematically tortured my child for her own psychological gratification. The jury's reaction to David's testimony was visible shock and outrage. Several jurors were crying as David described finding Emma in the basement chamber, and their expressions toward Diane Mann ranged from disgust to barely controlled anger. Diane's defense attorney, Harold Douglas, attempted to portray the abuse as excessive discipline rather than criminal torture, but the evidence was overwhelming. The basement chamber, the restraint equipment, the photographs of other victims, and the video evidence of Diane's systematic cruelty painted a picture of calculated child abuse that no jury could ignore. The most damaging testimony came from other victims who had finally found the courage to come forward. Amanda Ingram testified about being abused by Diane as a child, describing years of torture that had been covered up by her wealthy family to avoid scandal. Diane Mann destroyed my childhood and traumatized me in ways that I'm still dealing with 30 years later, Amanda told the court. She convinced my parents that the abuse was necessary discipline, and they allowed it to continue because they valued their social reputation more than my well-being. The pattern of abuse was undeniable, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Diane Mann was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, ensuring that she would die behind bars for her crimes against children. But Diane's conviction was just the beginning of David's campaign for complete justice. Christine's criminal trial for child endangerment and conspiracy was scheduled for the following month, and David had been working with prosecutors to ensure that her punishment would be severe and permanent. Christine's defense strategy was predictable. She claimed to be another victim of her mother's manipulation, insisting that she had no knowledge of Diane's abusive behavior and that her affair with Clayton Lindsay was a separate issue from her daughter's abuse. My client was deceived by her mother just as much as anyone else, Christine's attorney, Roman Stout, argued during opening statements. She trusted her mother to care for her daughter, and that trust was betrayed. While her marital infidelity was wrong, it doesn't make her criminally responsible for her mother's independent actions. David knew this defense strategy was coming, which was why he had spent months gathering evidence that proved Christine's knowledge of and complicity in Diane's abusive behavior. The recordings of Christine and Diane discussing Emma's discipline were devastating, but David had also uncovered evidence that Christine had witnessed Diane's abuse of other children and had chosen to ignore it. Eric Booth's investigation had revealed that Christine had been present during several incidents where Diane had abused children at family gatherings. Other family members testified that Christine had seen Diane dragging crying children to isolated rooms and had heard the children's screams, but had never intervened or reported the abuse. Christine Finley wasn't just complicit in her mother's abuse of her own daughter, the prosecutor argued. She was complicit in a pattern of child abuse that spanned decades. She knew what her mother was capable of, and she deliberately placed her daughter in danger to facilitate her own selfish plans. The evidence of Christine's complicity was overwhelming. Phone records showed that she had been coordinating with Diane about Emma's discipline while simultaneously planning her affair with Clayton Lindsay. Financial records proved that Christine had been funding Clayton's real estate properties that were used for child abuse, making her a financial participant in the conspiracy. Most damaging of all were the recordings of Christine dismissing Emma's previous complaints about Diane's treatment. Emma had tried to tell her mother about being hurt by her grandmother, but Christine had told her daughter to stop exaggerating and show more respect for your elders. David testified about these incidents with cold fury, describing how Christine had ignored their daughter's pleas for protection while simultaneously planning to use Emma as leverage in their divorce proceedings. Christine knew that her mother was abusing our daughter, and she chose to ignore it because the abuse served her purposes, David told the jury. She wanted Emma to be compliant and traumatized so she could claim that I was an unfit father. She sacrificed our daughter's well-being for her own financial gain. The jury's reaction to Christine was even more hostile than their response to Diane. Where Diane was seen as a mentally ill predator, Christine was viewed as a mother who had betrayed her most fundamental duty to protect her child. Christine's conviction on all charges was swift and decisive. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison for child endangerment, conspiracy to commit abuse, and financial fraud related to her participation in Clayton's schemes. But David's most satisfying moment came during the victim impact statement phase of sentencing, when he was allowed to address Christine directly about the consequences of her betrayal. You were Emma's mother, and you chose to sacrifice her safety for your own selfish desires, David said, his voice steady and cold as he stared at his ex-wife. You conspired with a child abuser and a violent criminal to destroy our family, and you used our daughter as a weapon in your scheme. For that betrayal, there can never be forgiveness. Christine broke down, crying as David spoke, but her tears only reinforced the jury's perception that she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. David felt no sympathy for her suffering. She had made her choices, and now she would live with them for the rest of her life. The final piece of David's legal victory came when Clayton Lindsay's federal trial resulted in convictions for racketeering, child endangerment, financial fraud, and conspiracy charges. Clayton was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again be able to harm women or children. As David left the courthouse after Clayton's sentencing, he reflected on the complete nature of his victory. Diane Mann would die in prison. Christine would serve 15 years and emerge as a registered child abuser with no prospects for rebuilding her life, and Clayton Lindsay would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. But more importantly, the child abuse network that had terrorized wealthy families for decades had been exposed and destroyed. Dozens of families were facing criminal charges, and the survivors were finally receiving justice and support for their trauma. David had protected his daughter, destroyed his enemies, and dismantled a network of corruption that had hurt countless children. The victory was complete, but David knew that his work wasn't finished yet. Emma still needed her father's protection and support, as she continued to heal from her trauma. And David had learned that the world was full of predators who would target the innocent if good people didn't have the courage to stop them. David Finley had discovered that he was capable of being far more dangerous than anyone had imagined when it came to protecting what mattered most to him. And he was prepared to use that capacity whenever necessary to ensure that Emma would never again face the kind of evil that had nearly destroyed her childhood. Chapter 8. The Price of Justice. 2 years after the trials that had destroyed David's enemies, he stood in the living room of his new home, watching Emma play with her friends in the backyard through the large windows that provided clear sight lines to every corner of their property. The house was smaller than their previous family home, but it was designed with security and Emma's safety as the primary considerations. Emma had made remarkable progress in her recovery, though the trauma of her abuse would always be part of her story. She was 8 years old now, bright and curious, but with an awareness of adult cruelty that no child should possess. David had ensured she received the best possible therapy and support, and she was surrounded by people who understood her needs and protected her well-being. Dr. in Rutherford continued to work with Emma regularly, and her latest evaluation showed that Emma was developing healthy coping mechanisms and maintaining appropriate relationships with other children and trusted adults. Emma has processed her trauma in remarkable ways, Dr. Rutherford told David during their monthly consultation. She understands that what happened to her was wrong, that it wasn't her fault, and that she's now safe. Most importantly, she maintains complete trust in you as her protector. David felt pride in his daughter's resilience, but he also remained vigilant about potential threats to her safety. The media coverage of the child abuse network trials had made their family a target for both supporters and critics, and David had implemented comprehensive security measures to protect Emma from unwanted attention. The house was equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, and David had hired a team of private security specialists to monitor their daily activities. Emma's school had been briefed about potential threats, and only pre-approved individuals were allowed to have contact with her during school hours. David's legal practice had evolved significantly since the trials. He had become one of the state's leading advocates for child abuse victims, using his experience and expertise to help other families navigate the legal system when their children were harmed. The Samuel Finley Foundation, named in honor of David's father's memory and his commitment to protecting the innocent, provided legal representation and support services for families who couldn't afford private attorneys. But David's most important work remained focused on Emma's continued recovery and development. He had restructured his law practice to allow for maximum flexibility in his schedule, ensuring that he could be present for every important moment in Emma's life. The afternoon ritual of homework and playtime in their backyard had become a symbol of the normal childhood David was determined to provide for his daughter. Emma was laughing with her friends, showing no signs of the trauma that had nearly destroyed her life, and David felt a sense of accomplishment that was far more meaningful than any legal victory. David's phone buzzed with a call from Detective McCall, who had become a close ally in the ongoing investigations related to the child abuse network. The detective's cases had resulted in over 30 convictions and had exposed corruption in multiple wealthy families across the region. "David, I wanted to update you on the appeals process," Detective McCall reported. "Diane Mann's appeal was denied by the state Supreme Court. She'll die in prison, as she deserves. Christine's appeal is still pending, but her lawyers aren't optimistic." David nodded with satisfaction. The appeals process had been lengthy and expensive for his enemies, draining their remaining resources while providing no relief from their convictions. Diane Mann was already showing signs of declining health in prison, and Christine had become a pariah among other inmates due to her conviction for child abuse. "What about Clayton Lindsay?" David asked. His federal appeals were exhausted last month. 40 years without parole, and he's been having a difficult time in federal custody. Word is that other inmates don't appreciate child abusers, and Clayton's reputation for violence against women has made him a target. David felt no sympathy for Clayton's suffering in prison. The man had facilitated the abuse of dozens of children and had conspired to steal David's assets while endangering Emma's life. Whatever consequences Clayton faced in federal custody with a natural result of his own actions. The conversation was interrupted by Emma running into the house, her face bright with excitement from playing with her friends. "Daddy, can Sarah and Jessica stay for dinner?" Emma asked. "We're building a fort in my room, and we're not finished yet." David smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, grateful for every moment of normal childhood joy she experienced. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll call their parents and make sure it's okay with them." As David arranged the dinner plans, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since discovering Emma's abuse. The man who had once focused primarily on winning legal cases and building professional success had been transformed into someone whose entire existence revolved around protecting and nurturing his daughter. But David didn't regret the transformation. His legal career remained successful, but it was now focused on meaningful work that helped other families rather than just generating income. His personal life was simpler but more fulfilling, built around the relationships and values that truly mattered. Most importantly, David had learned that he was capable of far more than he had ever imagined when it came to protecting the people he loved. The systematic destruction of everyone who had threatened Emma had required patience, strategic thinking, and absolute ruthlessness, but David had never hesitated to do whatever was necessary to ensure his daughter's safety. That evening, as David tucked Emma into bed after her friends had gone home, she asked him a question that demonstrated her continued processing of her trauma. "Daddy, do you think Grandma Diane is sorry for what she did to me?" David considered his answer carefully, knowing that Emma needed honesty balanced with age-appropriate explanations. "I think Grandma Diane is probably sorry that she got caught and has to face consequences," David said. "But I don't think she's sorry for hurting you, because people who hurt children usually can't understand that what they're doing is wrong." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad she can't hurt other kids anymore. So, my sweetheart, and I want you to know that no one will ever hurt you again. Daddy will always protect you, no matter what." Emma smiled and hugged her father tightly. "I know, Daddy. I'm not scared anymore because you're here." As David turned off the lights in Emma's room and settled into his own evening routine, he reflected on the complete nature of his victory over the enemies who had threatened his family. Diane Mann would die in prison. Christine would remain incarcerated for over a decade more, and Clayton Lindsay would never again be free to harm women or children. But more importantly, the child abuse network that had operated in wealthy families for decades had been completely dismantled. Dozens of perpetrators were facing justice. Survivors were receiving support and treatment, and new protective measures had been implemented to prevent similar abuse in the future. David had achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish. Emma was safe, his enemies were destroyed, and the system that had failed to protect children had been reformed through his efforts and those of his allies. The price of that justice had been the complete transformation of David's life and priorities, but he considered it a price worth paying. He had learned that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect, and that some enemies deserved complete and permanent destruction. As David prepared for sleep in his secure home, with his daughter safe in her room and his enemies neutralized forever, he felt the satisfaction of a man who had faced the worst kind of evil and emerged victorious through superior preparation, strategic thinking, and absolute determination. The game was over, justice had been served, and David Finley had proven that some fathers were far more dangerous than anyone could imagine when their children were threatened. Chapter 9. Legacy of Protection. 5 years had passed since the basement door had opened to reveal David's worst nightmare, and now he stood in the conference room of the Samuel Finley Foundation, reviewing the annual report that showed their organization had helped over 500 families navigate the aftermath of child abuse. Emma, now 11 years old, sat beside him, having insisted on participating in the foundation's work despite her young age. "Daddy, Mrs. Rodriguez called to thank us for helping her daughter," Emma reported, reading from a folder of thank you letters. "She said the lawyers we provided helped her family get justice when the police wouldn't believe them." David smiled with pride at his daughter's involvement in their mission. Emma had become an advocate for other children who had suffered abuse, using her own experience to help families understand that recovery was possible and that justice could be achieved. Emma's recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations. While she would always carry the memories of her trauma, she had developed into a confident, compassionate young girl who understood the importance of protecting others from harm. Her weekly therapy sessions with Dr. and Rutherford had evolved into monthly check-ins, and her psychological evaluations consistently showed healthy development and strong coping skills. "Emma, you've become quite the advocate for children's rights," Dr. Rutherford had observed during their most recent session. "You've taken your painful experience and transformed it into a source of strength that helps other families. That's remarkable maturity for someone your age." David agreed, though he remained vigilant about ensuring that Emma's advocacy work didn't interfere with her normal childhood development. She attended regular school, participated in age-appropriate activities, and maintained friendships with children who understood her need for security but didn't treat her differently because of her past. The Foundation's work had expanded far beyond David's original vision. What had started as a response to Emma's abuse had grown into a comprehensive organization that provided legal representation, therapeutic services, and family support for child abuse victims across multiple states. Detective McCall had joined the Foundation as Director of Investigations, using his law enforcement experience to help families navigate the criminal justice system. The detective's cases continued to result in convictions and systemic reforms that protected other children from similar abuse. "We've identified and prosecuted over 60 perpetrators in the past 5 years," Detective McCall reported during the Foundation's board meeting. "But more importantly, we've changed how law enforcement and social services respond to reports of child abuse in wealthy families. The old system of covering up abuse to protect reputations has been largely dismantled." David nodded with satisfaction. The network of corruption that had protected child abusers for decades had been replaced with a system that prioritized children's safety over family reputation and social standing. The most meaningful aspect of the Foundation's work was the support it provided to survivors of the original abuse network. Amanda Ingram had become a spokesperson for the organization, using her recovery journey to encourage other survivors to seek help and pursue justice. "David's courage in exposing this network saved my life," Amanda told a television reporter during a recent interview. "I've been carrying the trauma of my childhood abuse for 30 years, convinced that no one would believe me or care about what happened. But the Foundation showed me that justice was possible and that my story mattered." David's legal practice had evolved to focus exclusively on child protection cases, making him one of the most respected advocates in the field. His reputation for ruthless efficiency in destroying child abusers had made him a feared opponent among defense attorneys who represented perpetrators. But David's most important role remained being Emma's father. He had restructured his entire life around her needs and development, ensuring that she would grow up feeling safe, protected, and empowered to protect others. The evening routine of homework, dinner, and family time had become the foundation of their relationship. Emma was an excellent student who excelled in academics and extracurricular activities, but David made sure that her achievements were balanced with relaxation and play. "Daddy, my teacher wants me to write an essay about someone who inspires me," Emma said during dinner that evening. "Can I write about you?" David smiled, touched by his daughter's admiration, but concerned about drawing too much attention to their family story. "What would you write about, sweetheart?" "About how you saved me from Grandma Diane and helped other kids who were hurt like I was," Emma replied. "I want to write about how fathers should protect their children and never let bad people hurt them." David considered this request carefully. Emma's essay would likely attract attention at school and possibly in the media, but it would also demonstrate the healthy way she had processed her trauma and transformed it into a source of strength. "You can write about protection and advocacy," David agreed. "But remember that our work is about helping families, not about making ourselves famous. The important thing is that children are safe, not that people know our names." Emma nodded seriously, understanding the distinction between meaningful advocacy and self-promotion. "I just want other kids to know that their daddy should fight for them if someone tries to hurt them." That evening, as David reviewed the Foundation's latest cases while Emma worked on her essay, he reflected on the complete transformation of their lives since the night he had received her desperate video call from Diane's basement. The enemies who had threatened his family were gone forever. Diane Mann had died in prison the previous year, her health destroyed by the stress of incarceration and the hatred of other inmates who despised child abusers. Christine remained in prison, with 8 more years to serve on her sentence, and would emerge as a registered sex offender with no prospects for rebuilding her life. Clayton Lindsay continued to serve his federal sentence, and reports from the prison suggested that his history of violence against women and children had made him a target for other inmates. But more importantly, the system that had allowed such abuse to continue had been dismantled and replaced with protections that prioritized children's safety over adult convenience or social status. David's phone buzzed with a text message from Eric Booth, who continued to provide security consulting for the Foundation and other high-profile child protection cases. Saw the news about the Peterson family arrest. Another network exposed thanks to the protocols we developed. 37 children rescued. David smiled with satisfaction. The investigative techniques and legal strategies they had developed during Emma's case were being used to protect children across the country, creating a lasting legacy that would prevent abuse for generations to come. As David tucked Emma into bed that night, she showed him the draft of her essay about protection and advocacy. The writing was sophisticated for an 11-year-old, but more importantly, it demonstrated Emma's understanding that her trauma had been transformed into a source of strength that could help others. Some people think children can't protect themselves from bad adults, Emma had written, but they're wrong. Children can tell the truth about what happened to them, and they can help other children by sharing their stories. My daddy taught me that survivors can become protectors, and protectors never give up on helping people who need them. David felt pride in his daughter's wisdom and resilience, but also a renewed commitment to ensuring that she would never again face the kind of evil that had nearly destroyed her childhood. "I'm proud of you, Emma," David said as he kissed her goodnight. "You've become exactly the kind of person the world needs, someone who uses their strength to protect others." Emma smiled and hugged her father tightly. "I learned from the best, Daddy. You taught me that families protect each other, no matter what." As David turned off the lights and settled into his evening routine, he reflected on the complete nature of his victory over the forces that had threatened his family. His enemies were destroyed, his daughter was thriving, and their work was protecting countless other children from similar trauma. But most importantly, David had learned that true strength came not from professional success or financial achievement, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the people who mattered most. David Finley had discovered that he was capable of being far more dangerous than anyone had imagined when his child was threatened, and he had used that capacity to create a legacy of protection that would endure long after his enemies were forgotten. The basement door had revealed the worst of human evil, but it had also revealed the best of parental love and determination. And in the end, love and determination had proven far more powerful than greed, manipulation, and cruelty. Emma was safe, justice had been served, and David's work would continue protecting children for generations to come. The game was over, and David had won completely, not just for his family, but for every child who would never have to face the kind of evil that had once threatened to destroy everything he held dear. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.